Okay, so now we're going to talk about Windows deployment services. The idea behind Windows deployment services, on Windows 2008, we are able to configure image files of various operating systems, Windows 2008, Windows 7, that sort of thing, and we're able to store them centrally, and then you can have your servers and your client PCs start up and talk to their DHCP server, for instance, and be pointed to this Windows deployment server. Select the Windows image that has been chosen for them, have them download that, and basically go through the installation automatically. So it's an unattended install. That saves a lot of time. It's a whole lot better than going from machine to machine to machine and putting in a DVD, configuring the specific settings, putting in a license key, that sort of thing. So it's really a time saver. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by showing you how to install the Windows deployment services on a Windows 2008 server, and then we'll go from there and work through some additional steps. But the very first thing that we need to do is get the role installed. In Windows 2008, most things can be done through what's called Server Manager. You don't have to do everything through here, but it's a good centrally located tool to do that. And you'll notice there's two buttons here, or two selections, roles and features. A role is going to be something like an Active Directory domain controller, a DHCP server, or Windows deployment services. A feature is going to be more something like setting up failover clustering or network load balancing, something that enhances the role. So, but we're going to install a new role here. So we're going to select Add Role, and you see that one of the options here is Windows deployment services. We're just going to check that. Go next. It's going to give us some information. You're welcome to read that. And it gives you an option of whether you want to install a deployment server or a transport server. A deployment server is going to be used if you want to use that machine to deploy the images. You want images to be stored there, and you want your client machines to reach out and pull those images down. Or if you're just using the server kind of as a connection point in order to send out multicast information to clients, but you're not putting your image files and everything on there, you can just have it as a transport server. But the full functionality of the of Windows deployment services is if you have both of them on there. So we're going to leave both of those checked. We're going to say next, and it's a pretty straightforward deal. So now we're going through an install, and that's really how we get Windows deployment services installed. Once this finishes, we're going to let that wrap up, and then we're going to go ahead and do some configuration work. Okay, so now the role has been installed, and in the interim I went ahead and installed DHCP on this machine too. The reason for it is that Windows deployment services requires DHCP somewhere on the network, and since this is just a test environment, I'm going to put DHCP on the same box. So let's take the next step. We've got, you can see whenever we go open Start and Administrative Tools, we have Windows deployment services, and we can expand that, and you see that my local server is listed, but it also says Windows deployment services is not configured, which is why we have that little exclamation point. So I'm going to go ahead and configure the server, and it gives you a couple things it wants you to make sure of. It wants to make sure it's a member of an Active Directory domain, services domain, make sure that DHCP is active on the network, make sure that DNS is on there, and that the file system partition is NTFS. We have all of those things in place, so we shouldn't have a problem. We'll go next. We're just going to go ahead and stick with the defaults. You might want to change this. One thing it's going to do is give us this little warning here. Typically in a production server, you're not going to want to install your images on the same partition as your system files, and the reason for that is the system files are typically going to be doing a lot of stuff, and you might have contention if you're using the same hard drive for your system files as the image files. You might end up overtaxing one hard drive, or if one of your hard drive goes corrupt, you lose both the images and you lose the system stuff. If you put them on different physical hard drives, then you have you minimize the damage and probably shorten the restore time. But because this is just a test environment, we're going to stick with that and say yes. Now, because we have DHCP on this machine, we have to select both of these. If it was on a different machine, we would not select these, and we would then have to go into the DHCP environment, and we would have to manually configure this option 60. But because the DHCP server is on this machine, we're going to need to have Windows deployment services not listen on port 67, because DHCP uses that port, and then DHCP is going to automatically configure this for us. So we have three options here. We can say that we can have Windows Deployment Services not respond to any client computers, respond only to known client computers, and known client computers are the ones that have been staged in Active Directory. So you can create Active Directory objects, computer objects, and mark those as Windows Deployment Services clients, so that when one of those clients tries to find the Windows Deployment Server, Active Directory sort of pre-approves that and allows it to go ahead and install. Or you can just go ahead and say respond to all of the computers. This is probably okay in a small environment, but if it gets very big, what you're going to find is that you're going to want to always check this require administrator approval for unknown computers. So if any random computer wants to install an operating system, you're not going to want it to just go do it. You're going to want to approve it as an administrator. And if you have an environment with thousands and thousands of computers, then you're certainly not going to want to have to approve over and over and over. So typically I would think in the larger environment you might want to select the respond only to known client computers, and you'll have to do some work in Active Directory to make sure that functions. But for our purposes, we can just let it respond to all client computers. We're still going to set it up so it tells us what is being requested, and we get a chance to approve it. And again, that's only on unknown client computers. So if it's a known computer, like it's an object in Active Directory already, it's not going to query. It's not going to ask us. So this next step right here, it's going to ask us to add images to the server. We're going to unselect that because we have no images ready yet, but we're going to configure some of those and then we'll go back and add those later. But we're going to go ahead and finish that, and you can see that it's now no longer unconfigured. It shows various folders that it has set up and that sort of thing. And the next step we're going to take is we're going to look at setting up some images, putting them into this environment so that when clients boot up, they can have an operating system to install. Okay, now that we have the Windows Deployment Services installed and the WDS server configured, what you've got here is basically an environment ready to be used. Nothing's in it yet. If you look, install images, boot images, there's nothing in there. Now let's talk about boot images and install images really quickly. When we've got a machine that we're going to let Windows Deployment Services configure, that machine has to, first it has to find the Windows Deployment Services. And there's a couple of pieces to that. First, you have to have a NIC or a network card that is it's compliant with PXE booting, pre-execution environment booting. So if it is, it's going to know to go out to DHCP, request an IP address. DHCP is going to supply it some information, and part of that information is going to point it to the Windows Deployment Services machine. So then it's going to come to the Windows Deployment Services machine, but because this new machine, it doesn't even have an operating system on it, there's nothing that it can do. So the boot image is a smaller file that it's going to pull down, and it's going to pull it down using the trivial file transfer protocol, TFTP, and that's port 69 for those that are interested. It's going to pull down this boot image, and the boot image contains the Windows pre-installation environment, or what you're going to hear is Windows PE. It's a real lightweight version. In our case, it's a real lightweight version of Windows Server 2008. So what it's doing is it's saying, here's enough information for you to boot, for you to do your basic stuff. Okay. Once it's got that in place, then it's going to look into the install images, and we're going to provide it a list of potential operating systems that it can choose. And from the client side, it should see a menu, and it should be allowed to check those. And remember, whether or not it's going to be allowed to pull down and install an operating system is going to be based on whether or not we have set up WDS with, whether it's responding to client requests at all, whether it only responds to known clients, those that are pre-staged in Active Directory, whether it responds to any client. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to install the boot image and the install image, and in order to do this, I want to first, okay, so we've got I've got a .iso file, an ISO file for my Windows media. Okay, so when you've got that, and if you're using Hyper-V, that's how you get it in here. Is you insert the disk, and it'll pull up a window here to. And it's kind of lagging, but it'll pull up a window here to give you an option of what ISO file you want, and this is the one that we're using. So now that I've got that, I can actually use I can use that ISO file just like it's a DVD, right? So essentially, I've got a Windows 2008, a Windows Server 2008 R2 DVD that's available to me. And so I'm going to go into the sources directory, and within the sources directory there's two files. The first one that I'm interested in is called boot.wim, and the second one is called install.wim. That's right here. So I'm gonna import boot.wim into the boot images. I'm going to import install.wim into the install images. Okay, and I'll say this in advance. In a production environment, you can go and make changes and come up with custom boot images and custom install images. You can build answer files. You can do all kinds of interesting things so that when your clients reach out, they're going to have special boot files to use, and the images that you're downloading are not just default Windows operating system images, but they're images that contain, you know, different drivers and different screen settings, basically whatever you want, time settings, language settings, whatever. But for our purposes, we're just going to do the default. So I'm going to start by adding the boot image, which is boot.wim. I'm going to go to the D drive, sources, and you see it's easy because they don't have everything listed there. So boot.wim, and next, you see that this is the default image name. That's fine, no problem. And we'll say next. And it's going to take just a little bit to import it, so I'm going to pause while we go ahead and do that. Okay, you can see that the boot.wim file has been successfully imported. I hit finished, and you can see that it's sitting here in the boot images folder. You can see the size, the date it was taken, it was imported, the OS version, the whole 9 yards. Now I want to take the install images. There's a little bit more that we want to do here. I'm going to create an image group. The image group is useful because what you can do is you can take a cluster of images and you can apply, for instance, a service pack to all of the images that are within that image group. Okay, so I'll just call it image group 1. All right, and then I'm going to add an install image to it. And notice install.wim, it was already pointed at that sources folder. Open, next. What you see here inside the install.wim file is a list of all of the potential operating systems that you can install, right? So if you want all of them to be available, then go ahead and leave them all on there. If you only want a couple of them, let's say that you only want, let's say that I only want people to be able to install the standard server and the enterprise server, and I don't want them to install the core server or anything like that. Okay, so we'll say next. So these are the only two images that are going to be available to clients when they reach out and try and grab in this particular process. Say next, and it's going to go ahead and add them. I believe it's going to probably take a little while as well. This is a much bigger file than the boot.wim file because it contains all of the OS information and all of that. So I'm going to go ahead and pause it again here, and then whenever we're ready to move forward, we'll take the next step.